Yeah, it's a fuel, yeah. Yeah, I bought it during COVID.
Bien. ¿Sí? ¿Aló? ¿Se escucha bien? ¿Aló?
No,
Yeah.
¿Aló? Ahí sí, ¿no? ¿Aló? Ahora sí, ya estamos. Bueno, muy bienvenidos todos. Estamos muy contentos de que poder recibirlos acá en el Instituto de Estudios Urbanos, en el campo de la Facultad de Arquitectura, Diseño y Estudios Urbanos. Para los que no me conocen, soy Roberto Moris, soy profesor tanto de la Escuela de Arquitectura como del Instituto. Y esta conversación es parte de una conversación que esperamos que siga y que sea de largo aliento. Ya llevamos con Calpoli varios años trabajando juntos, así que es una tremenda posibilidad que tenemos al frente más próximo. Ya. Así que no voy a hacer una introducción completa de todo lo que estamos haciendo, solo decir de que estamos muy contentos que la delegación de California pueda estar acá, en vista de que no nos conocemos todos. Yo creo que voy a dar la posibilidad de aprovechar en un grupo chico para que todos se puedan presentar. Como decía, esto es aprovechando una relación que ya tenemos hace mucho tiempo con Calpoli. En este momento la delegación de California, que son expertos en fuego en distintas áreas de lo que es la prevención y la respuesta de emergencia, vinieron a Chile producto de lo que fue el incendio reciente en Valparaíso, Viña y Quilpué, pero también a aprender específicamente de lo que es el caso Botania, que fue el que se presentó en muchas partes como una tremenda, casi un milagro, pero lo interesante de que esos milagros tienen que ver con un trabajo anterior muy potente que se ha venido haciendo en la región de Valparaíso y que también por eso nos interesa aprender esa experiencia a todos, pero también ver cómo lo que se ha estado haciendo también en la región metropolitana con el trabajo con AP y Senapred es algo que nos permite aprovechar la conversación del desastre de Valparaíso para poder también hablar sobre el futuro, y por eso estaban acá también el gobierno regional, Cáritas, y hay una serie de actores que están ahí que han participado así es que solo darle las gracias por estar acá. Le voy a pasar la palabra ahora a Miguel para que nos pueda presentarse.
Hola, buenos días. Mi nombre es Miguel Muñoz, director regional metropolitano del Senapred.
Hola, muy buenos días a todas y todos. Mi nombre es Carolina Rojas, yo soy subdirectora de investigación de acá del Instituto de Estudios Urbanos. Así que también aprovecho de darles la bienvenida. Nos enorgullece mucho que venga una delegación de California a tratar un tema tan relevante como son los incendios forestales. Además, supongo que se han dado cuenta que hay varias similitudes como climáticas, actividades económicas entre California y la zona central de Chile. De hecho, hay una cooperación también en lo que es la costa, bueno, en el vino. Hay varios temas muy relacionados. Y qué más que aprender de la experiencia que tienen en California sobre la gestión de desastres y de incendios forestales. Como sabrán, en este verano nos tocó pasar por una experiencia bien complicada. Y la gestión, sobre todo la experiencia de este barrio de Botania, nos demuestra que con planificación, con gestión, con organización, podríamos enfrentar estas catástrofes. Así que bueno, reiterar la bienvenida y que ojalá tengamos una jornada súper enriquecedora. Gracias.
Hola, soy Pirosca Ángel, yo soy geógrafa, hice aquí en esta escuela el magíster en asentamiento urbano y medio ambiente y trabajo aquí desde el 2016 en diferentes proyectos de investigación y actualmente soy la coordinadora en proyectos Egipto, ustedes ya lo conocen. Hola, mi nombre es Valentina Infante, yo soy investigadora postdoctoral de dos instituciones, COES y UDEMOS, y estoy también anidada acá en el Instituto de Estudios Urbanos, y el tema de los incendios, los desastres naturales, no es mi tema, pero quería aprender que de otro mundo, de otra perspectiva y enriquecerme, así que por eso estoy acá en realidad.
Hola a todos, buenos días, mi nombre es Daniela Savieso, soy ingeniero en recursos naturales de la Universidad de Chile y magíster en asentamiento urbano de la Universidad Católica. Tal como vieron acá, trabajo acá desde el año 2016. Soy coordinadora del proyecto SIGIR y también cofundadora del proyecto CACA.
Hola, soy Valentina Lagos, estoy estudiando planificación urbana y estoy terminando la maestría en planificación urbana en México. Muy recientemente, voy a realizar la producción del profesor Boris en incendios. Hola, muy buenos días. Mi nombre es María Pazillo. Soy coordinadora de monitoreo, evaluación, accountability y aprendizajes en Cáritas Chile. Trabajo en el proyecto con el que estuvimos trabajando en Canal Chacao, en el barrio Botania. Soy psicóloga comunitaria de formación.
Hola, yo soy Camilo Vergara, geólogo de formación especializado en conservación del patrimonio natural, profesional del Departamento de Medio Ambiente del Gobierno Regional de Santiago. Tenemos un programa de prevención de incendios forestales en santuarios de la naturaleza de la región metropolitana.
Hola, Gerardo Pérez, ingeniero civil, en diseño avanzado y soy parte del equipo SIGIR.
Soy Rodrigo Kulodowski, soy arquitecto y magíster en arquitectura, soy subdirector de sistemas del proyecto SIGIR y cofundador de CAPA.
Buenos días, soy Rosario Walker, arquitecto y magíster en proyecto urbano, me dedico a la planificación territorial y actualmente estoy también trabajando en el proyecto SIGIR como coordinadora.
My name is Margot McDonald, and I'm a professor of architecture at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and my interest is in wildfire in the built environment, so buildings and landscapes. Thank you for the invitation to be here.
Good morning, my name is Frank. I am the director of the Wildland Urban Interface Fire Institute in Cal Poly. I've been there about a year.
Good morning, my name's Andy Anderson. I'm here as part of the Fire Institute Advisory Council. I had a 32-year career with CAL FIRE. And so I worked a lot of the same catastrophes that you guys just experienced here. So very thankful for the invite, looking forward to today.
Good morning, I'm Dave Lineker. I'm the fire chief of the Memorándum Fire Protection District in California, and I'm a veteran fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University, working on wildfire and insurance. Because wildfire is abstract, insurance is annual, and our insurance crisis is happening right now in California.
Gracias, Dave. Le voy a dar la palabra porque no solo que presente pero que pueda presentar.
Hello, good morning. I'm Magdalena Vicuña. I'm professor here at the Instituto de Estudios Urbanos y Territoriales. I'm an architect and I'm also a researcher at SIGIR, which is the Center for Research on Integrated Management of Risk. And I'm
Integrated management.
risk management.
Yes, thank you.
Risk management.
Yes.
I'm also my research specializes on urban planning and risk management. And I'm really tired because I'm running on 4 floors. Stairs.
Magdalena SIGIR is the same research center where Jorge León that you met in Viña del Mar is the same team. Bien, solo para dar inicio necesito habilitar la función. Visto que hemos estado visitando varios lugares, la comuna de Quilpué, Viña del Mar y Valparaíso, y nos vamos a presentar un carrusel de imágenes para dar una idea de lo que ha sido la visita. También quiero aprovechar de agradecer las participaciones de muchos organismos que se pusieron a disposición para que pudieran calzar las fechas los tiempos de viaje, tener gente en terreno, con Cáritas en el municipio. O sea, realmente ha sido súper bonito que todo haya podido calzar. Yo creo que eso es lo más relevante. Así que aquí les voy a ver, denme un segundo, que me di cuenta. Estaba. Ahora sí.
¿Ese que fue?
Sí, voy a ir ya aprovechando disparando.
Compartes la pantalla y que se comparte
Mira,
la salida.
dame un segundo. Mira. Pero no, que antes estaba acá abajo. Sí, el orden es el siguiente. Primero partimos en Quilpué, en donde está Botania, que es parte de la agrupación Canal Chacao. Luego está al día siguiente un trabajo en el Ministerio de Vivienda, donde trabajamos con el Servio y Ceremi. Luego visitamos Valparaíso, una experiencia del profesor Lautaro Ojeda de la Universidad de Valparaíso también, en los cerros de Valparaíso, un proceso de reconstrucción, un proceso muy interesante. Al día siguiente estuvimos en la municipalidad de Viña del Mar, donde tuvimos la posibilidad de tener una reunión de trabajo bien extensa con la alcaldesa y su equipo. Y luego hicimos una visita al terreno a la Villa Independencia, que fue donde hubo mayor impacto. Y ayer estuvimos en la embajada norteamericana, también estuvimos la mañana en el gobierno regional, en el laboratorio SIGIR, y donde estuvimos con la unidad de medio ambiente del gobierno regional. Y en la tarde hicimos una visita con CONAF y Senapred a Águila Sur, que es un proyecto también de proyecto de comunidades preparadas. Así que eso es. en 2 viviendas del proceso de viviendas de emergencia de Senapred. En el caso anterior se veían las 2 viviendas de Senapred más una de autoconstrucción de la misma familia. En ese tramo aquí también se ve donde estaba la casa. Ahí murió el dueño, porque fue a buscar al superviviente. Y ahora están los supervivientes de Senapred. Bien. Bueno, le voy a dar la palabra ahora a Miguel, director de Senapred, que hemos estado trabajando hace mucho tiempo en distintos proyectos sobre gestión y prevención de riesgos y ahora ha sido un tremendo apoyo también en el desarrollo del proyecto SIGIR, en lo que ha sido esta visita y por sobre todo yo creo que lo que viene adelante.
Bueno, primero que nada agradecer la presencia de los especialistas en incendios forestales. Yo diría que esta reunión y esta reunión que hemos tenido con ustedes han demostrado muchas similitudes en cuanto a que los incendios forestales nos pegan de igual manera, independiente de las diferencias, digamos, en capacidades técnicas, helicópteros, aviones. Al final tenemos el mismo incendio, tenemos la misma afectación y tenemos un agente que se mantiene como común denominador, que es el ser humano. Y es ahí donde tenemos que centrar los esfuerzos para poder educar, para poder preparar comunidades, para evitar, en primer lugar, que se generen los incendios forestales y si se generan, puedan tener una primera respuesta mientras llegan los organismos técnicos correspondientes. Diría que esos son los casos que a lo mejor de Botania y particularmente lo que vimos ayer en el condominio Águila Sur con el equipo de emergencias del condominio Águila Sur que tienen preparación por CONAF para enfrentar incendios forestales, para hacer labores preventivas. Ayer nos dimos cuenta que además hay un trabajo que es muy familiar, van involucrando a sus hijos y van haciendo una aposta de generación tras generación en la temática de incendios forestales y particularmente el cuidado de la naturaleza, que fue una cosa muy importante. Ayer estábamos viendo con Roberto que nos vamos a juntar con ese equipo para además entregarles otro tipo de herramientas. Una cosa es lo forestal, pero ellos mismos ayer fueron indicando que ellos están expuestos a otro tipo de amenazas. Nosotros como servicio habíamos estado 2 semanas antes en una búsqueda de una persona que no se encontraba hasta el día de hoy. Y ahí tuvimos que coordinar brigadas del ejército, brigadas de bomberos, carabineros, una serie de actores. Y ahí se dieron cuenta que esto va más allá, por lo tanto vamos a incorporar también a su capacitación el Familia Preparada, que es un programa en que definitivamente, en definitivas cuentas, lo que hace es cómo la familia, como núcleo elemental, ¿no es cierto?, de la sociedad, se prepara y planifica frente a emergencias. Les enseñamos microzonificación de riesgo, es decir, ver a cuáles riesgos y amenazas están afectos en su entorno más cercano y cómo se organizan para enfrentarlas. ¿Ya? Y además el CERT, que son los equipos comunitarios de respuesta a emergencia, para darles también herramientas que tengan que ver con extinción de incendios estructurales, el rescate urbano superficial, primer apoyo psicológico y lo fundamental, y que yo diría donde tenemos como país todavía un saldo que pagar, que es el sistema de comando incidente como herramienta para la administración de la emergencia en nuestra red. Nosotros de a poco hemos ido involucrando el sistema de comando incidente, trabajando con bomberos, trabajando con CONAF, trabajando con el SAMU, con carabineros, con el GOPE, que es el Grupo de Operaciones Especiales de Carabineros. Pero necesitamos avanzar más profundamente en ello, hay que especializar aún más. con USAID hemos trabajado esta temática, tanto capacitaciones en el nivel básico, intermedio y avanzado, pero todavía nos falta mucho por recorrer porque en la medida que hablemos un mismo idioma en las emergencias, evidentemente la emergencia va a ser mejor manejada. Tenemos otro tema también que yo creo que es importante evaluar, y es que, ¿por qué es importante el sistema de comando de incidentes? Porque de alguna manera tenemos que votar esos egos institucionales que no dejan que los sistemas funcionen. Nosotros tenemos un sistema muy disgregado. De repente, en un incendio, 2 puestos de comando, podría ser uno. Le cuesta mucho trabajar el comando unificado. En esa línea tenemos que trabajar desde la perspectiva de los respondedores. Y desde la perspectiva comunitaria, que las personas sepan, ¿no es cierto?, conozcan el riesgo, sepan dónde viven, que convivan con el riesgo, ¿no?, que no le teman al riesgo, que se preparen y sepan qué hacer. Y finalmente, luego de ver la presentación, yo creo que es importante que ustedes sepan es que Chile, en materia de viviendas de emergencia, ha ido evolucionando paulatinamente, desde una mediagua, que eran 4 paneles, ¿no es cierto?, con un techo, y eso era todo lo que se entregaba, hasta hoy día una vivienda que podríamos decir que es una primera vivienda progresiva, que tiene instalación eléctrica certificada, están conectados a alcantarillado, y si no, se les coloca fosa séptica, agua potable, baño y un pequeño lavadero. Y además es ampliable, por lo tanto, ha cambiado sustantivamente la calidad de la vivienda. Y eso también ha hecho que cueste aún más y sea un poco más lenta la instalación de las mismas. En Valparaíso los terrenos son muy complejos para poder instalarlas. Eso es cosa número 1. Cosa número 2, son tomas, es decir, son asentamientos irregulares. Ahí tenemos un tema legal que es súper complejo también de manejar. No obstante ello, en 1 mes y medio, desde Senapred, ¿no es cierto?, se han logrado levantar 1.209 viviendas, que es un hito histórico, más allá de que a lo mejor alguna tenga algún problema eléctrico o no, que han sido marginales dentro de todo lo que ha pasado. De hecho, muchas personas tienen una mejor vivienda que la que tenían antes del incendio. Pero ahí también hay un avance sustantivo. Bueno, Roberto es parte de esa historia, porque trabajó en el diseño de esta vivienda, pero yo creo que eso también es importante que se sepa. Y tal como hablábamos antes, esto todavía estamos en un estadio de desarrollo, hay que seguir avanzando. Yo creo que los sistemas que creen que se lo saben todos ya parten erradamente. Todos aprendemos unos de otros, así como ayer ustedes aprendieron, ¿no es cierto?, algunas cosas que nosotros estamos desarrollando a nivel comunitario. Nosotros hemos aprendido mucho de California. Yo te estaba explicando, yo participé en la elaboración del MOU con la Agencia de Emergencias de California y también con el FEMA, y he trabajado firmemente con ustedes en estas temáticas. Estamos habilitados para hacer el listos también, particularmente con Bomberos Santa Bárbara. Hemos trabajado mucho, por lo tanto hay todo un desarrollo de instructores CERT para trabajar, pero es mucho lo que falta por hacer, mucho lo que falta por hacer.
Muchas gracias, Miguel. Le voy a dar la palabra a Frank para que nos pueda dar una idea de hacer una síntesis de los temas que hemos estado conversando en estos días en las distintas actividades. Así que, Frank.
YouTube, ahí hay un micrófono. You can... Again, good morning. I'm going to give you a little bit more background on myself now. I too am from the fire service. I'm not from what we call it the academy or academia. I flunked retirement to come back and take this position. I worked in the fire service from 1979 until roughly 2 years ago. And you know, what Miguel said, that we need to bury our egos and we have much to learn. I will admit, somewhat embarrassingly, I didn't understand the changes that were happening in 3 key areas that we'll discuss in a few minutes. Oh, I'm sorry. My wife tells me I'm a soft talker, which is good. I can always talk loud when the kids are upset. So I want to be very clear. People with a lot of experience, sometimes you can have just 1 year of experience and you do the same thing for 40 years. It's not really 40 years of experience. It's 1 year over and over again. And as things were changing, I finally realized I didn't understand the dynamics. There's a saying in our country that we can be prisoners of our own experience, bias, different types. And my focus in the fire service, like a lot of us, is we prepare and train, and we get the call and we go and we do whatever is necessary. And as soon as things start getting remotely stabilized, our job is done and we go. But there are then decades of recovery after that we usually don't deal with. And so our attention span is pretty small in the fire service. It's very focused, but it's pretty small. So kind of the joke is I'm the 62-year-old freshman at Cal Poly, trying to find my way around the campus. I've got a couple of parking tickets so far. I've been there. But the reason I came is that I realized we had this disconnection between the emergency response and our mindset. We had a disconnect between all of your specialties. We weren't integrated enough. And so that's what started my interest in coming back to work at this institute. So what we'd like to do is we have truncated this presentation so that between Dave and I, we can get through this in maybe about 20 minutes. There are more slides, but we'll save those as our discussion. And that's what we're having this morning, is a discussion. I'm not here presenting because I have some lofty opinion or capability. We're just starting the conversation. I'm here because I want to learn, as are all of us. We're here because we want to learn what you've been doing. I had no idea the similarities. The similarities are very layered. And so I think there may be some things that either we've done or we've already done wrong, and we would say, no, don't take that exit. Or if you do, here's what's down there. And in other ways, there are things that you're doing that we never thought of that are really good. Last night when we met with the group there, in our world, we would call that an all-risk fire department. It means they handle everything. They're not some insignificant or untrained small band of people. They are a very well-trained, well-prepared, well-informed force. And it's like with finance. Early money is better than late money. And so early intervention and early prevention is much better than managing the consequences after. So I'm going to just run through a few things. And if we can maybe, if there's a concept I mentioned that doesn't translate well, I've been giving our translators a real workout this week. Let me know and we'll back up. But mostly, let's try to hold those until we have kind of an open conversation, and we'll pull more information out. Is that okay? Very good. All right. Oh, that's fine. That's okay. All right. So we're here to discuss how we think we can provide a path forward on ways to really manage the risk in this complicated space. But I need a translator to push these buttons. This side. Here, upside down. Oh. Yeah, there we go. Forward. Okay. So we're here because of unprecedented levels of loss. There were fires long before I came into the fire service. We burned down buildings long before I arrived. But it really wasn't until probably 2017 was our hinge point, if you will, of understanding. And so if we just look back the last decade, we're seeing huge increases in the number of fires and human caused fires. Most of our fires are human caused. That's usually pretty uniform. Concurrently, though, we're finding that a lot of our life and property loss aren't necessarily on large fires. They're usually on fast moving fires that don't necessarily burn a lot of acres. If they're near urban centers and they're moving quickly, that's the real problem. So why is this happening now? We think there are 3 incremental changes that have happened slowly over time, but their combined change have caused a synergistic increase in this risk that we're all now responding to. So let's walk through these. The first is we have an extraordinary amount of resources. And back in the early 1900s, we established a policy to suppress all wildfires by 10 o'clock the next day from the time they were discovered. And there were a lot of different reasons for that, and it was important for us to do that. But after 100 years of doing that, in fire-dependent landscapes, I'm going to repeat that, fire-dependent landscapes, we now have way too much fuel. It's not normal. The landscape can't sustain it. So things become stressed. They're weaker. They can't withstand things. So that's one thing, is we've accumulated fuels for 100 years. Trying to remember through the there we go. Thank you. So we have had, especially since the mid 1940s, we've had a big increase in our development in these fire-dependent landscapes. And there are different economic reasons for that. That's some study we should do with you, is figure out why that's happening. So now we have more structures and people out in these places that have a natural fire ecology. So probably not a big surprise that we're having that issue. The last one that is, I'm not a climate scientist, but of the concepts in that, the one that makes sense to me is something called vapor pressure deficit. Essentially, it just means that if you have 2 air masses of an equal amount, if one is warmer, it can hold more water. Think of that when an air mass comes in at low elevation off the ocean, once it hits the mountains and starts to rise, temperatures get colder, it precipitates, the water falls out. When that starts to happen at a global level, global warming, the atmosphere globally can hold more water. And when that happens, there's now the equilibrium that the plants used to be used to between how much water was in the air and how much water the plants held. They had adapted to have that equilibrium. That equilibrium is changing now because the atmosphere can hold more water, and so it is pulling more water out of the plants, and it's not something you see. We're just starting to understand some of this so that it doesn't look like it changed, but we're watching the fire behavior change. And that is significant. So we think these 3 incremental changes over time are what's causing this rapid escalation of fires, difficulty to suppress, loss of life and property. This is just one picture. This is a famous area in our country, Yosemite Valley. And you can see that picture on the left is back from the 1800s. Picture on the right is fairly recently. There's actually been a fire in there since then. But you can see it, that's an example of the accumulation of fuel. Now multiply that thousands and thousands and thousands of times over the US. You have too much fuel. You can see on the right, if you look close, you see some of the trees are gray, in fact, quite a few of them. And those are stressed trees. Those are trees that are dying from bark beetles and other things. So not only do we have too much vegetation, it's really, really dry. So it is weak and ready for combustion. When we look at vapor pressure deficit and how it correlates to acres burned, if we take the climate science and specifically vapor pressure deficit, and we project that forward, what we see in terms of annual acres burned is the record year that we've had will be eclipsed by about 300% or roughly the next 5 decades. So imagine a very bad fire year like you've had. with those losses, multiply them by 3. We think these are unimaginable, but much harder days are ahead if we don't make changes. I did put on the slide, I got permission from these researchers. They gave me permission because I thought this was so important. The research is out there, but on this slide particularly, they asked that if you do use the slide, that you contact them first so that they can give you the context of what that means, so it's not misused or misunderstood. And this presentation, Dr. Morris will have this. So one of the first times I understood we were having a complete misunderstanding between our various professions on this risk. I had some property owners, I'll call them the Smiths. One of my fire inspectors went out and did an inspection about what should you do to keep your property safe from wildfire. And they've done a wonderful job. So we gave them, 2 gold stars, A+, very good. But before the week was out, their insurance company dropped their insurance. They said, no, we can't insure you. There's too much wildfire risk. So understandably, they contacted me, their fire chief, and asked, how can this be? And you can imagine I felt pretty embarrassed because I couldn't answer the question. And that's what really had me starting to pull on this thread. And so when emergency services and are fulfilled and we think we've done a good job, and it's so disconnected from the losses that we're giving the property owners completely different information. Obviously, they're confused and we're not going to change anything. And so that's really what started me on this process. In stable systems, looking to the past is a pretty good way to start getting an idea of what will happen in the future. It's like driving down a very long straight road. And if for some reason you couldn't see out of your windshield, I don't know, we're going to have a big cicada hatch in our country. I don't know if you have periods where you run through and maybe a bunch of things get on your windshield. You just can't see real quickly. If you're on a straight road, you can actually stay in the road by looking in your side mirrors, because if you're looking backwards and you're within the 2 white lines, you're fine. If it's a straight road. But our road forward is now starting to curve a lot because of climate. And what we didn't realize is that all of our modeling was based on the past, and it doesn't apply anymore. So we're having to recreate the way we predict future losses. So essentially what we've taken away is that we can't suppress our way out of this. I don't know that, I think we have probably some of the most robust equipment and people and capacities for firefighting in California, and we're losing. It's our situation is identical. It's just a matter of scale, but there are no differences. And so we can't fight our way out of this. In fact, that's probably what made some of it worse, because we've been accumulating these fuels. We can't regulate our way out of it. So I'll explain why in just a minute. And on the risk transfer side of reinsurance, I had no insurance background before I started this. And it was the last thing I was thinking of as a firefighter. But I came to realize that that was an integral part in our country. It's where it engages here is different, but I think when we talked with the mayor the other day, we realized there's a very similar aspect here. It's not quite visible yet, but it's very, very real. So we can't advance by using old policies. We need to adapt. So I think this is a nested policy construct where all the stakeholders want the same thing. They want to prevent losses of life and property from wildfire. I mean, have you talked to anybody in your circles who wouldn't agree with that? I don't think so. I think that's one we can all, slap the table on and say yes. So we know that the way you would do that is you do what we would call mitigations, these things that you do to keep from losing properties, we would call mitigations. And so those policies that kind of come in 3 ranges. The first is for the existing structures, there are things you can do for an existing structure that will make it more resistant to wildfire. We'll cover those in a minute. Then outside of the structure, it's the ground immediately adjacent, especially the first 5 feet, but out to about 100 feet. So the 0 to 5 area, top priority, it's very important. And then there are decreasing levels of severity of the type of mitigations you have to do. And then beyond about 100 feet, the radiant heat falls off to the point it's hard for, we'll talk about heat transfer in a minute. So that's how you would reach that out. In our country, that's not what we did, because that's hard work. We went to risk policy. So our regulators and our financial markets, they went to the tools that they know best. And so they tried to change what was happening on the ground by policies. They're pulling on the levers they're familiar with. But until the conditions on the ground change through mitigation policy, you can pull on those levers all you want, and nothing's going to change. The concept of this is that all my career, before a disaster, earthquake, flood, fire, the types of preparations and mitigations that we approve are based on social and political acceptability. That's before the emergency. Let's say you draw a little line on the timeline. So before the emergency, you do the risk policy based on what's acceptable. Once the emergency happens, that's the realm of physics. In my career, I've never seen what's socially and politically acceptable change the physics of gravity or heat transfer or hydrology. So we have to find a way to push the realities of the physics of these disasters further into the decision space of what we'll tolerate. It may feel good, it may be acceptable, everybody's happy, until an afternoon or an evening when a fire comes through. And we will not have fulfilled our mission unless we have these courageous conversations. So we're approaching this, my colleagues and I, with the idea that we want to disrupt the propagation of fire from about a half to a quarter mile out away from an urban center. At some point, all the fuels we've accumulated are going to have to burn. There's no financially feasible way to reduce those fuels. So we can't reduce the fuels of 100 years across, an entire continent. Can't do that. So we're reacting to the conflagration levels of loss, and that's where we need to focus, because the most important priorities are lives and property. So we're focusing right around the urban centers. So about half to a quarter mile out. We're using our unit of analysis or action is 100 or more homes. Every community can decide if they want to do less or more, but we just pick one. And whenever the structure separation distances are 70 feet or less, in 50% of the cases, you have enough density under conflagration conditions, which are usually dry, strong winds, to carry the fire from one structure to another. This is a very important point. These start as wildfires, but they're not wildfires once they get burning. They're urban conflagrations. So we can't approach this from, oh, well, we'll just have wildfire trained people, and then magically there's some dividing line, and then we'll just have de bomberos who are designed for structure fires. This burns as a system, so we have to mitigate it and respond to it as a system. So that's the definition of a WUI community. It's really about how close are the fuels. We think of homes and structures, but the truth is, from a physics standpoint, they're just fuel. And over time, what's in the structures has changed. Where we've gone, a lot more of our interior contents have synthetics, plastics, which I generally call frozen gasoline. plastics, once you start them on fire, they burn like gasoline, a tremendous amount of heat. The smoke looks different, as opposed to if all you had wood inside or cellulose-based products, they don't burn as hot and they take longer to burn. So these structures now are turning into big, huge fuel loads. So that's what causes these urban conflagrations. It's structure to structure spreading. So that would be what we would call the structure to structure fire pathway. Fire starts in one structure, moves to the next. So that's one pathway. The second pathway, think of it like a donut. And that donut, with the urban center in the whole, goes from the outside of the urban center about 100 feet or so out into the landscape that will carry wildfire to about 2 layers of homes or structures that are tightly packed enough in. And that's what we call the vegetation to structure pathway. And that we'll come back to why that's so important, but that we then bring another set of mitigations to disrupt that pathway. And then the third pathway is it's at the perimeter, as I said, from about a half to a quarter mile out in, and that has to do with vegetation to vegetation. So to sum up, there are 3 fire pathways within about a half to a quarter mile of an urban center. And it is vegetation to vegetation, which we normally think of as like regular when you see a wildfire. Then there's the vegetation to structure, which is this transition from a vegetation fire to a structure fire. And then there's structure to structure pathway, which is just a conflagration. It's not a wildfire. I just want to make sure and pause there real quick. Does that make sense? Okay.
Maybe si pueden volver atrás, explicar qué quiere decir SD y qué quiere decir
yes.
SO.
I'm sorry. Structure, separation, distance. I'm sorry, we have all kinds of accent acronyms. I'm sure you do in your world too. SOI is, we call that a sphere of influence, probably a term you're familiar with. So the sphere of influence we're worried about is just right around the urban center. That's my workshop. That's my office. Did I answer your question, Dr. Morris? Yeah, thank you.
No sé si lo dije, pero no quiero.
El SSD es el...
No, claro, pero el otro es el sphere of influence. Y también, no sé si ya lo dijiste, que el buffer de la relación vegetación-estructura está en el rango de media octavo de milla, que serían 400, 800 metros, no sé si ya lo comentaste. El cuarto que está entre un cuarto y media milla, el buffer, la distancia. ¿Sí?
Right, so 2 elements, the sphere of influence being the vegetation to vegetation pathways approaching the community within approximately 1 kilometer, so that the terminal movement of the vegetation fire, because with regard to protecting communities, we are not concerned if the land around the community burns, as long as the fire doesn't enter the built environment. So creating a bifurcated view of the problem where there is a wildland vegetation fire, which CONAF and others from a forestry management perspective are concerned about, but a separate, distinct view of the problem that is focused on the built environment and on the structures. And as Frank alluded to at the beginning, in a fire-dependent landscape, such as Central Chile, such as the Western United States or California, there is no future in which we will have no fires. Fires will occur, fires should occur. The exclusion of fire is how we got here. So the question then is not excluding fires, it's managing those fires for beneficial outcomes, low intensity beneficial fires that restore the landscape. And to do that, we must have fire adapted and resilient communities that can be in or adjacent to a fire perimeter without experiencing large scale loss. And that is all about preventing the vegetation to structure transition. And we believe the critical components to that are disruption of the terminal pathways through the vegetation that lead to the community based on speed, so that the fire doesn't outrun the response and the time it takes to evacuate the residents. Is, as we saw in Botania, the firefighters who were present were not fighting fire. They were assisting with evacuation because we prioritize life over property, and property over the environment. And then once we've disrupted those pathways to the community, we harden the homes and the perimeter of the community through vegetation management within that last 100 feet or 30 meters. And then with a real emphasis on the last 2 meters next to the home, where the presence of combustive material can form receptive fuel beds that flying embers and sparks and firebrands can alight on and can ignite a new fire, irregardless of the fact that the community may have been surrounded by fuel treatments or fire breaks or other things, because the fire can pass over them and ignite structures. And once those first structures, with a structure separation distance of less than 70 feet on average, once those first structures ignite, it is no longer a vegetation fire. It is now a structure to structure urban conflagration, which is, we're into a different space with regard to mitigations. And we will find that a home that is prepared to receive wildfire, when the adjacent structure begins to burn, we've exceeded the design parameters, the design limitations of our wildfire risk reduction efforts. So a home could be 100% compliant with what we need for a vegetation fire protection. But when the adjacent structure is burning, flux, the watts per meter squared over time of the structure will exceed the design capacity of our wildfire mitigation measures, and becomes a fundamentally different fire at that point. And ultimately, for the design folks, when the adjacent structure is burning, the structure needs to be built of concrete and nothing else to survive. And that's simply not realistic in the environment. Thank you. Next slide, please. Great, and keep building up. Thank you. So for fire to spread, and this is basic fire science, but it's also immutable laws of physics. No matter how much we would like something else to be true, these are true. Fire needs heat, fuel, oxygen, and an uninterrupted chemical reaction. And in a structure fire setting, often the fire is limited by the oxygen supply. Right? Buildings are generally airtight, and a compartment fire takes time to grow and to spread. But in a vegetation fire, it essentially has unlimited supply of oxygen. So we are very challenged to disrupt the fire chain in the wildland setting. Fires are going to burn unless we remove the fuel. And this is right, either by removing it or changing the configuration. Light flashing fuels, grass, weeds, if you will. If they're uncut and vertical, the greater surface area, more exposure to oxygen, they will carry fast moving fire. That same fuel load, when cut and laid flat, we change the configuration, but not the load. Fire cannot burn as quickly there because there's limited surface area and the oxygen becomes self-limiting. And the way these propagate is through convection, conduction, radiation, and direct flame contact. And that's it. So fire cannot spread across a landscape that does not have a substrate of receptive fuels. So by modifying the fuels, we can change the chain. And this requires a great deal of education, and our partners at CERT and other community foundations are critically important to this, because a resident, an untrained, non-firefighting professional resident of Botania, who watched this massive fire come off the hill, has a very clear sense that they are facing a force of nature, and it can lead to a sense of powerlessness. This is unstoppable. There's nothing we can do. It is out of our hands. And from the macro perspective, that's true, but we're not trying to solve the macro perspective. We're not trying to prevent fires from burning across the landscape. We're simply preventing fire from making that transition into the homes. And as we saw in Botania, 30 meters of vegetation management and a 2-meter concrete block wall kept that community from burning. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't magic. It was physics, and that they happened to clear out just enough vegetation at just the right place. And that was luck. It wasn't particularly well thought out. They just got lucky that their work was done in the exact right place. But it's understanding the elements that come together and the degree to which alignment between topography, weather, and fuel can take a benign, slow-moving backing fire and convert it to a raging head fire that is moving very fast, has long flame lengths, and is able to overwhelm either the mitigations that have been put in place or the firefighting response. And so by understanding these simple facts, and that this is not new, this is not emerging science, this is well understood and has been known for a very long time. The definitive paper on how to model wildfire was written in 1972, which was probably before most of us were born, Frank excluded. So the point being is we know how to do this, but we need to convince our residents in these fire-prone areas, these residents who have built into the wildland-urban interface of these facts, and to agree on the mitigations that matter, the core mitigations that have the greatest efficacy at scale, so that folks can make their communities fire resistant and resilient. So here's an example of modeling that we did in an area of Northern California. This is on a northeast wind day in Northern California. These are days with high winds and low relative humidity. Not particularly hot days, but very, very dry. And that low humidity and the high winds have a desiccating effect that they dry out the vegetation to make it more receptive. It lowers live and dead fuel moisture to the point that they're capable of critical fire spread. And from an ignition line to the northeast of the communities, and that the areas in gray are the values at risk, the populated portions of the communities. We ran an ignition line to say, we don't know where this fire started. We don't particularly care where this fire started. We just know that if fire gets to this point where that line is drawn, under these weather conditions, it will spread in this manner. And you will note it is not a wall of fire. There are distinct pathways where fire makes runs and then it fills in, makes runs and it fills in. And those runs are where topography, weather, and fuel have come into alignment. So a terrain feature that is aligned with the wind and is full of vegetation, a terrain feature that is aligned with the wind, full of vegetation, and the fire is moving upslope, where convective preheating and cross-compartment heating come into effect. And so by understanding the pathways where fire will move most quickly, we can understand the points of entry, and we can understand where mitigations will have the greatest benefit. So in Northern California, at least, there's been a fascination with fuel breaks, with basically cutting a line, almost a road, if you will, of modified vegetation across the landscape. And what happens is they are overwhelmed because you have too much fuel mitigation where you don't need it and too little where you do. And if fire breaches the line, it'll self-propagate, right? So I'm sure many of you have worked on flood issues and on rain issues and so forth. Unlike flood, fire self-propagates. If you have a small hole in your roof, you have a leak, not a flood. If you have a small amount of fire in the walls of your house, you have a total loss. So if one drop of fire, if one ember makes it over the line, you have lost, which is why we need to understand what fire is going to do so we can focus and prioritize our efforts to the points where they'll have the greatest efficacy. So the next thing we looked at is how we can put treatments in place that will slow a fire. So here we see a close-up of the fire pathways in orange. We see treatment recommendations as the green lozenges with the black line around them. That's an area where either grazing, mechanical thinning, cutting of grass, trimming of brush, or the use of prescribed fire in advance of an event are used to modify fuels. And the green shows the increase in the arrival time, the green splotch that spreads out. Dark green is better. So that if fire is anticipated to run along this pathway and we have modified the fuels along that pathway, we will slow the fire's arrival into the community, which buys time for the evacuation of the residents to get those at risk out, to aggregate the firefighting response, to bring together the firefighters that are needed to protect the homes at those points of entry, both the entry of the ground component of fire and the ember distribution zone, where flaming firebrands and embers could carry in advance of the main body of fire. And once fire gets into the community, the question is always, what next? Previously, we have not had the ability to model fire spread in the built environment. Structure-to-structure fire spread models just didn't exist. There were too many unknown factors, and attempts to convert existing wildland fuel models to structure models just weren't very effective. With work we're doing with Colorado State and Dr. Hussam Mahmood, we're taking a look at how we can understand fire spread through the built environment, structure-to-structure fire propagation using graph theory. So understanding the connections of nodes and the edges that connect those nodes and the tendency of each node to promulgate fire through surrounding edges to adjacent nodes, specifically structure to structure, structure to vegetation, and structure to, in our case, we have a high frequency of wooden fences connecting homes, and those wooden fences act as wicks, as edges that draw fire from structure to structure. So ultimately, we believe we have all of the tools to understand what fire spread looks like in both the wildland setting, the pathways that lead into the community, the vegetation to structure transition, and ultimately the structure to structure conflagration that's associated with our large scale losses. And there's an analog to this, which is interior structure fire in the United States. So starting in 1968, there was an agreement that the loss experience in our major cities was too high. Too many homes and buildings were burning in urban areas, and too many lives were being lost, with a focus on New York City, specifically on the Bronx. No wildland vegetation there. Highly populated, very dense, high rises, old building stocks, and poorly maintained buildings with a lack of enforcement of codes. So a commission was created in 1973. It published a report called America is Burning, and this led a fundamental change in our approach to not only the stringency of our building codes, but the enforcement of them. And as a result of that, through the enforcement of these codes, through following the science, through putting aside the political concerns and restrictions that this would be too much, that it would be too expensive, it would be too impactful, by just following the science, we have reduced the instances of structure loss down to 1% of the fire service's total call volume. And we simply do not see the loss of life and the loss of property we once did. In North America, new buildings do not burn because they are sprinklered, they are engineered. And if a fire starts in a compartment, it is contained to the room of origin most of the time. And that's just engineering, pre-fire engineering systems exclusive of the firefighting response. And so that when there are failures of systems or there are things that have been modified, there's still enough time because of the passive measures that are in place that are inherent to the building design that firefighters can come and contain the building. So we have engineered our way out of this problem. We believe the time is right to take a similar approach to the wildland problem. So to that point, in 2021, a Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission was formed at the federal level, and they just in the last several months have published their report on a multi-pronged approach to reducing wildfire losses in the wildland-urban interface and preventing vegetation fire-initiated conflagration in our WUI communities. And we believe all the pieces are here. We have all the tools, and it is time to replicate what was done 50 years ago in the structure environment to do the same thing in the wildland-urban interface. And really what we believe is that the application of our legacy systems, applying forestry techniques to the wildland-urban interface does not work. It is a fundamentally different fire. It is a fundamentally different loss experience. Most of the United States Forest Service work has been done to protect trees. And I'm not opposed to trees. I think trees are fine. But my focus is on protecting structures and communities, because I believe if we can create fire adapted and resilient communities that can be in or adjacent to a fire without experiencing loss, that will unlock the use of fire as a management tool in the forested landscape, which, as Frank alluded to, is the only way we will get to the acres burned on an annual basis that we need to maintain equilibrium in fire dependent landscapes. And I believe this is doable. We can do this. We just need to marshal the political will, and we need to provide the science and the research that will give our politicians the will to enact, enforce, and support the more restrictive standards for building and maintenance of vegetation around buildings that we need to prevent losses at large scale in our wildland-urban interface communities. I'd be happy to answer any questions or engage in a conversation, which is. Yeah, I'll let you close. You're close, right?
Yeah, you just go ahead and read them.
También conclusión, estamos en la conclusión y ahora dejar de mirar el problema y empezar a resolverlo. Las tareas económicas han llegado a ser nuestro compromiso, todos los víctimas de
So one additional thought I want to put out, and then I think we'll open up to discussion. It's always easier when we're trying to do something new to point to something that we're familiar with as a concept and then transition it to this new concept that we're trying to get people to go to. So from an academic perspective, we've had oceanographic science and terrestrial science much longer than we've had coastal science. And it took us a while to discover that extending oceanographic study into the coastal areas didn't provide enough predictive capacity or didn't handle the complexity of the coast. It's the same thing extending terrestrial policies and studies into the coastal areas. It wasn't sufficient. So then we developed coastal sciences. We recognized the complexity of the interface of land and water was too great to try to explain it or manage it, predict it by legacy sciences, yelling over the fence at each other, kind of like the wildland urban problem, where we have our urban planners frustrated with kind of sort of yelling over the fence, if you will, at the land manager saying, if you would just solve your problem out there, we would be okay. And of course, the land managers are shouting over the same fence saying, well, if you would just solve your urban problems, this wouldn't be a problem. So I think we're just now arriving at the same conclusion that we can't manage this in this bifurcated either response or planning. And so it's time for us to have a dedicated special science for the wildland urban interface, because it's very complicated. It's truly interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, which is why Cal Poly chose to dedicate an institute to that study. So thank you for your patience, and we'll do our best to answer. Let's have a discussion, we're here to learn as much. One other thing I heard yesterday that was, I didn't realize this. Apparently in the firefighting tactics, the use of fire to fight fire is not, it's not a tactic. If I understood it right, is that correct? Yes. So
Con
we-
aplauso.
what's,
Con aplauso.
oh, they do.
Sí, sí.
Okay, I must have misunderstood him yesterday. I think we have to come to the conclusion, as Dave said, no matter how good our prevention is, we have to approach and prepare for the future as if there will be ignitions and fires, and we have to adapt our communities to live in them. Something will always get through. And actually, the longer we don't have any fires anywhere, trust us, we've done this. We are now, what was the statistic? We're at 98% efficiency at suppressing all fires.
90% of fires contained 10 acres or less.
So 90% of fires contained at 10 acres or less. All of our losses are in that last 10%. I think it's actually even smaller than that. It's just the fires on the really, really bad days. So, but the whole point is that's how we accumulated the fuels. It's going to be like, we'll discuss it. So I think it's time to have a dedicated science for this problem. Just like you have integrated risk management, you understand that treating risk in integrated systems, but treating the risk separately doesn't work. It's synergistic. So we need to take that approach here.
Can I say something real quick? Really quick, another key point of this is what the Fire Institute at Cal Poly has done. They're talking with other colleges and so on and so forth. And the one key thing, the reason I'm here, like I said, I did 32 years in the fire service. I worked for the state fire department in California. I, like Dave, did really bad at the retirement thing, and after being retired 6 months, I was really bored. And so this shirt I'm wearing, PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric. It's the biggest provider of power in the state of California. We have the largest service territory, and our service territory is in terrain similar to what we see out here. What the Institute has done, and they're doing an excellent job at, and what's important for others to realize is you need to involve the key stakeholders. PG&E, we started some catastrophic fires that has numerous deaths. And it's something, that's why they hired me, was to help to figure out how can we stop these fires. So when we're thinking of this process, you need to also engage the other key stakeholders, because we can, with what they're trying to do here and trying to create defensible space, communities that are resistant to fire, you still also have to engage the ignition component. Majority of the ignitions, both in Chile and in California, are human activity. We have quite a few lightning strikes, but we also have quite a few ignitions from utility industry. And so they've done an excellent job of incorporating PG&E, San Diego Gas and Electric, and Southern Cal Edison into this discussion. And so hats off to them in thinking outside the box and coming here to this country as well. And when we're talking about learning from each other, that's just one of the things is we got to make sure all of the stakeholders that not only that can help, but also are part of the problem, need to involve them so they can learn as well.
Bueno, primero que nada, ellos que pueden sentarse en la mesa. ¿Se escucha? Sí. Por favor. Ya conocieron a Oscar Gutiérrez del Ministerio de Vivienda. Está también trabajando los planes de reconstrucción en Valparaíso. Muchas gracias por estar acá. Y bueno, abrirla para preguntas, comentarios. Y porque la verdad que hay muchas vueltas donde darle a esto. Bien.
Very much for your presentation. And we are having a seminar this afternoon at Universidad de Forestales, and we are actually going to discuss about some critical issues related to our urban planning instrument, our zoning code, which is the frame where we can define risk areas. However, our planning instruments are really
Castellano. Castellano.
obsoletos.
Obsoletos.
Obsolete. Some of these urban areas that are really vulnerable to risk have urban plans from the 80s, 70s, 60s. So they cannot incorporate risk areas. So I was wondering, how do you deal with this the urban planning timeline, which is usually very, very slow, unflexible, very politically contested, with the risk management tools, which needs to be very flexible, very situated, very locally situated, very with this contradiction about the timeline of risk management and urban planning. How have you dealt with that in California during those 15 years?
When you start.
So in the fire district where I'm the fire chief, the community was built in the 1930s. In the 1930s, no one was thinking about wildfire. The homes are very established, the community is very affluent, and I cannot move those homes. There's no political will, it's too expensive, etc. So topography, weather, and fuel are the only way that fire gets somewhere. So that is knowable. And the receptivity of the structure is a combination of the way the structure was built, the presence of combustive vegetation around the structure, and where it is sited on the landscape. If it's at the top of a long ravine or draw, it's in a bad place. So we really have three choices. We cannot build in the places that have high risk. But as I said, if the community is already built, or if you have an old plan, or if people are building informal settlements, irregardless of the urban plan, there's nothing to be done about that. Those homes are not moving. We can harden the homes, either with new construction, we can ensure or encourage, incentivize people to build in a fire resistant manner so the structure itself is hardened. We can retroactively correct elements of the built design that are not conducive to fire spread, specifically vents and openings that allow embers to gain access to the interior of the structure. Or we can clear out the vegetation. So as I said, topography, weather, and fuel. We can't change the topography, we can't change the weather, and it's getting worse, but we can clear back the fuel so that fire is less likely to spread with speed and intensity in those areas. And so in the case of a built community, such as the one that I'm charged with protecting, all of our focus is on retroactive hardening of the home and creation of risk reduction measures in the form of fuel modification, grazing, cutting of things, burning of things during benign conditions, moving back the edge of the fuel bed that will allow fire to spread. And I think it's important to recognize the conditions you are dealing with in each community, because a master planned community has not yet been built. We can be much more thoughtful about it in all of those domains. In an existing community or an informal community that is springing back up immediately following fire loss, then we need to play with some of our other options, such as pulling fuel back from the perimeter, since that usually involves dealing with one landowner, the landowner of the surrounding area, maybe even public land, as opposed to going door to door to door to door in densely packed urban areas where it would be much more difficult, much more time consuming. And unfortunately, if you don't get everybody in that dense area to carry out these mitigations, that one home that is not participated will ignite and will overwhelm the conditions on the surrounding.
I think another key thing is, I think I heard you say, your example the other day, Dr. Morris, was riding the bike while you're building it. So that's what you're charged with, right? You're trying to do good planning for 20, 30, 40 years in the future, but the fires are burning today. So we need to understand that what we have to change and do the hard work, the long-term work, so the future is different. But focusing on the future at the expense of the present, or vice versa, doesn't work either. So we have to get used to the idea. It's a little bit like Dr. Morris, if I understand it right, the impressive center that you took us to, this integrated workspace, you said you're building that at the same time you're using it, and you have to apply these tools before, in some cases you're ready. That is the reality here. So focusing too much on one at the expense of the other, that strategy won't work. So I think we have to get comfortable to look back and say, half of my time needs to be looking up to where I'm going, and half of it needs to be staring at my feet so I don't trip over the rock. That's difficult, but that is the situation. There's no avoiding.
Otra pregunta de planificación territorial. En Chile no tenemos una manera de regular áreas de riesgo por incendio forestal de manera directa. No sé si ustedes tienen en California alguna estrategia, por eso me pregunto, porque en el fondo lo que acá uno hace es que si uno quiere prevenir que un área urbana o la interfaz urbana esté afectada, pueda ser afectada por peligro de incendio, uno en el fondo genera distanciamientos con fajas viales o con áreas verdes, pero el problema es que uno no le puede poner límites a las áreas verdes, o sea, uno puede decir que sea solo pasto, que pueda poner esta característica a los árboles, o que en realidad el área verde sea solo un área normativa, pero que en realidad no tenga nada plantado, por ejemplo. Por lo tanto, es muy difícil de zonificar o de restringir, prevenir desde la norma el tema del riesgo por incendio. ¿Tienen alguna estrategia de la planificación que nos puedan entregar a nosotros?
I'll start my answer to your question with a question. What do you think are the primary concerns of the people who do have authority over those properties? You don't. What do you think is motivating them to not do any changes to the land? We understand that if this is the edge of the community,
Yeah.
and we're worried about this space, but we don't have any authority over it, can't force them to do anything. Is that the basis of your question?
Oh, no.
plan?
No, mi pregunta es, en el fondo, yo quiero planificar el territorio completo. Puedo poner el límite urbano donde está, básicamente donde yo quiero. Eso es cuestionable, pero lo puedo poner más allá, entonces poder regularizar ese espacio. La manera que tengo de prevenir o de generar una norma ahí es ampliar el límite para poder poner una norma. Pero, ¿qué norma pongo para generar esta prevención sobre el tratamiento del riesgo?
Right. Okay. So two things. Dave's going to answer part of this. He's going to tell you what to do. What we have heard is that the landowners may not want to do the work that is needed. What do you think their primary motivation for saying, no, don't do that here? What do you think's motivating them? Money?
Inversions. Yeah, building something that.
Well, usually what we find is they don't want to lose what they have. They like it just the way it is. But what's the primary cause of the fires? It's humans. The humans aren't wandering around on their property per se, but they're near the urban center. Fires go both ways. So most of the fires are human caused.
Yeah.
So the very thing that protects the urban center from the wildfires also protects the wildland from the urban centers,
Yes,
where a lot of times the ignitions are from.
of course.
So if you can't change the law, at least get with the property owners who don't want any changes and explain. Most of the ignitions actually come from the human side of the fence.
Yes.
But I'll say from a planning perspective, if you try to levy a requirement or recommendation that every year they go and cut the brush or something in time, those mitigations will fall off. They will stop doing them, particularly without enforcement. So a far more effective planning tool is to cite non-burnable features such as a soccer field that will be used regularly and maintained regularly and will never burn. Right? A grass or dirt soccer field will not burn. Yet because it has other uses and it provides other value to the community, it'll be maintained forever. Another example would be an orchard or a vineyard, something with economic value that will not burn, and it'll be maintained through that economic value it generates because people will tend the trees, they'll tend the vines, or the siting of things like shopping centers, areas, commercial areas with a lot of parking. So identifying those dual use features that serve both a fire risk prevention purpose and have some other economic value that will cause them to be sustained over time is far more effective, especially if this is being done on a voluntary basis. If you are asking people to go cut things or maintain them every year, it'll probably fall off as soon as you stop looking. But the neighborhood will maintain that soccer field because they like to use this soccer.
Give it the Rancho Mission vehicles.
In a development in southern Orange County, in southern portion of California, just inland, that burns a lot. We've been working with a new development, 17,000 homes being developed in open space. And the landscape looks just like this one. It's dry, it has a chaparral, brush mix, decadent grass. It's very little rainfall, all compressed into the winter months. And we've been working with them to do two things. One is to, previously when they built homes, the outer portion, the perimeter of the community were homes that had increased value because they could look out over the landscape. They had a beautiful view and people would pay more for that. Unfortunately, that also meant the homes abutted the wildland vegetation that would burn. So we worked with them to move the road, the perimeter road, from interior to exterior. So now there's a road behind them. And the road is 4 lanes. So it's about 10, 15 meters or so of non-burnable road. And then we asked them to put in a walking trail for bikes and pedestrians. They got another 5 meters or so. And then they put an additional 10 meters of vineyard, of vines, of wine grapes, which also will not burn. And so now you create this large swath of non-burnable, and then at the points of entry where the fire pathways and the ember threat zone would enter, they placed a sports field, a dog park in a commercial zone with a lot of parking and tilt-up concrete buildings that won't burn. So while they're still on a fire-dependent landscape that has a great degree of the high potential fires will burn there. Now those fires, as they enter the community, will bump up against non-burnable features that have other purposes. The road will be maintained because cars drive on it. The path will be maintained, the vineyards will be maintained, and the commercial area with all of its parking lot that will not burn will be maintained. And it's not reliant on an annual budget allocation for fire safety, which when times are tight, and money gets short, fire safety will be the first thing to fall off of the budget. So now it's self-sustaining in perpetuity.
Yo tengo una pregunta sobre eso mismo. Las medidas de mitigación que acaba de escribir.
Okay.
Las medidas de mitigación que acaba de describir, que funcionan como una especie de cortafuegos, ¿incluyen además un despeje del terreno o esa infraestructura se construye sobre el terreno despejado?
Right, the infrastructure is built within the urban limit, within the area where they had environmental approval to proceed. And that in this case, because particularly in this area of California, there's a great degree of environmental sensitivity, and preservation of open spaces is a requirement. So they were able to utilize area that they had permission to build on that otherwise would have been used for homes or other things. And they shifted some of the community amenities and some of the community infrastructure that they would have had to build somewhere within the development anyway. They just shifted it to the points where it had a dual use. So in these suburban master planned communities, typically the amenities are clustered by the entrance to the community, and you have fewer amenities in the periphery. Well, that means the homes that we're most protected and are the most vulnerable are at the worst place. So they didn't change the total allocation of space for amenities, for roads, for dog parks, for sports fields. They just shifted them to the point where they would have a dual use, and they would be effective for both wildfire prevention and as a community.
And so as an example to what he was just saying, in Botania, this area on the left lower side, we think what happened there is maybe the development was intended to go all the way to the end. It may have run out of money or something, we're not sure. But that big open area to the left could just as easily be a dog park. Right? And that was one of the, well, we can discuss that picture more later, but that was one of the aspects that saved that community. And it wasn't by design, but it functioned that way.
Aló, sí. Dave, si pudieras profundizar en el ejemplo de las viñas como una forma de cortafuegos también, porque bueno, en Chile también tenemos muchas viñas y la pregunta que hacía Rosario es como, ¿qué tantos instrumentos tenemos? Entonces, si empiezan a aparecer las viñas como una posibilidad de ponerlas, no lo habíamos visto, que yo recuerde, ¿no? Así, si pudieras profundizar en...
Sure. Orchards, vineyards, agricultural lands in fire spread modeling is characterized as NB3, non-burnable class 3. They simply will not carry fire. I was deployed on
explaining fuel types they mean.
So with regard to fire spread modeling, we use it's called the Scott and Bergen 40. They have identified all of the possible combinations of vegetative fuel and characterize them. So then on a map, you can characterize each pixel, typically at either 5 meter or 30 meter resolution, by the fuel that is most likely to carry the fire. So grass, brush, timber understory, etc. Agricultural land does not burn. Isolated instance, corn right before harvest, maybe, etc. But generally speaking, orchards, vineyards, agricultural land cannot carry fire because it's maintained in a manner and irrigated, etc. So on the big fires in Northern California and the Napa region in 2017, I was deployed there as a firefighter. The fire came running down off the hills through the brush, and as soon as it hit the vineyards, it just stopped because there was nothing to burn. There were not those contiguous fuel beds that would carry fire. And those are maintained forever and ever because the person who maintains the vineyard is interested in their production. And so when those can be integrated into the urban design, they are nice, they're sightly, they look nice, people like them, they create a pleasant atmosphere, they have economic value, so they are maintained regardless of fire safety, and fire will not burn through those areas, hard to stop. Same with a playground, same with a sports field, same with parking. And so for those of you who are urban designers, I think it is a question of how can we thoughtfully site these features in a way that they will interrupt the fire transition into the community. As Frank alluded to in Botania, on one side, there was a basketball court and parking. That was dirt. Fire did not burn there. On the other side, there was an area for future development that had been scraped, pushed down bare metal soil. Fire did not burn there. And on the third side, where all the risk was, the community had undertaken mitigations that pushed the fire back, the fuels back, the fire. So it was a combination of happenstance with the built environment, the future development area, and the basketball court parking, and active community work on the remaining side that brought it all together. I would argue, having met them and talked to them and seen their tool cache, if they had had a requirement to clear all three sides of the community, that would have exceeded their capacity and the amount of effort they could have put in, and that community would have burned to the ground. And so it was the fact that their work was limited to just one side because of the happenstance of those existing non-burnable features. That set conditions for a little bit of grant money, a little bit of training, a few hand tools. And it's a very modest collection of things they have, and a great degree of community engagement, understanding that a community working by themselves has some limits on their capacity because they're doing other things too. It's that combination where we reduce the amount of work the community has to do by incorporation of these thoughtful incorporation of these non-burnable features during the design process.
Muchas gracias. De hecho, creo que es interesante entrar por el hecho de que las preguntas hacia la planificación no pueden ser respondidas solamente con la planificación, que es un poco lo que ojalá quisiéramos, de que hay una forma de poner una zonificación, una norma, y de hecho las respuestas van a que hay planificación normativa, entra el diseño urbano, que parte de lo que estamos viendo acá tiene que ver con la forma en que está instalado el proyecto, que ese diseño urbano tenga consideraciones de la materialidad en las distintas escalas, incluso más allá del propio complejo. Entonces creo que lo interesante es poner la conversación como en el fenómeno, independiente de las distintas áreas, porque claramente por los planos reguladores nos acotamos mucho, y en esa línea, igual como los proyectos tienen que cumplir con la ordenanza, en condiciones urbanísticas, probablemente los proyectos de la interfase van a tener que tener una aprobación específica también de diseño y tener que asegurar un plan de gestión. O sea, todo ahí entramos a CENAPRED con los planes de gestión del riesgo como algo activo dinámico, no que el proyecto se aprueba y se separa. Y yo creo que eso es un camino que no está resuelto, porque obviamente todos estos caminos, o sea, los cambios normativos nos han tomado muchísimo tiempo para hacer frente al tema del riesgo. Pero creo que el ejemplo de las nuevas materialidades, porque es distinto trabajar en la parte de el bloque estructura, ¿no es cierto? Pero también es interesante lo que mostraba sobre estos dedos, ¿no es cierto? De que todas las partes de del parque, de la etapa de bosque con bosque, árboles con bosque, con árboles, tampoco se puede abordar todo desde la perspectiva de la zonificación, pero sí identificar los corredores, ¿no es cierto? Las rutas específicas, que ahí sí sea una cosa más táctica específica. Así que esa condición híbrida encuentro que me parece obvio decirlo, pero de alguna forma hay que calmarlo, ese discurso. Miguel estaba pidiendo la palabra Magdalena.
Yeah, real quick. From a planning standpoint, try to think of the wildland-urban interface as a system that, from a wildfire perspective, it has three dials: structure to structure mitigations, vegetation to structure mitigations, vegetation. So fire moves identically wherever it's at. The laws of physics apply. But the communities, the small little place, that you have unique systems. So you have to use different combinations of the mitigations. In some places, you can really turn one of them really up. In another place, you may not be able to do anything. So you have to use the others. So the other thing is that when you can do the things on the perimeter that Dave was providing, it also protects your responders. Everybody had to leave Botania because there was a very good chance everybody would have died if they would stay there, including the firefighters, if they were there to try to protect property. But if the incident commanders know that they can get as close as possible, but still not kill the people because there are areas that are survivable, then they can look at putting resources in places they normally couldn't. It also provides more protection from an evacuation standpoint to buy time.
No, la cuestión que va a hacer que tiene que ver con que la planificación en sí misma, la regulación en sí misma, los planos de reguladores en sí mismos, no son una herramienta que evidentemente indique que la gente no va a edificar o no va a habitar un lugar expuesto a amenaza. Por ejemplo, el sector de Talagante, la Manresa, viviendas que no son precisamente viviendas vulnerables, sino que son viviendas con piscina. La gente construyó en zonas en las cuales el plan regulador dice que es zona de exclusión. Igual construyendo. En Chile, por norma, no se puede construir sobre la cota 1000. Y tenemos mansiones en la cota 1000. Entonces yo creo que si no tenemos fiscalización a todo este tipo de herramientas de regulación que tenemos, la cosa no va a funcionar. En Chile, desgraciadamente, somos hijos del rigor. Si no nos sancionan, si no nos duele el bolsillo, las cosas se pueden hacer. Desgraciadamente. Hay un dicho que es, echa la norma, echa la trampa. Entonces, es parte de nuestra cultura, que desgraciadamente, si nosotros tenemos que tener, aquí es un cambio cultural, es un tema de educación, y que es largo. Y que, ojo, parte en el colegio. Y mientras educación no asuma esto, y no diga que no es el giro de mi negocio, estamos muy complicados. Es un proceso largo. Pero insisto, el plan regulador de Santiago, si no ha fiscalizado, si no están encima, si los municipios no ejercen la fiscalización correspondiente, vamos a seguir con lo mismo, y con lo mismo, y con lo mismo, y con lo mismo. Eso.
Voy a ir en español ahora. Me hace mucho sentido lo que plantean sobre la ciencia del juego. Nosotros el año 2010 tuvimos una catástrofe, un desastre producto de una tsunami más terremoto, uno de los terremotos, ¿cierto? Más catastrófico y más de mayor magnitud, ¿cierto? De la época. Y hemos desarrollado una ciencia relacionada a los desastres de tsunami bien robusta. Y estamos por sacar una ley de costas. Y estamos como avanzando mucho en ese sentido. Sin embargo, en el ámbito del fuego estamos muy en pañales, y me hace mucho sentido lo que plantean y pensaba ahora. Claro, aquí lo que hay que separar el carril, el track de la planificación urbana del track de los mapas de riesgo. Y tenemos que tener disponibles mapas de riesgo, modelación del riesgo a la mano, para la toma de decisiones de los privados, de las comunidades, independientemente si el plan regulador comunal, el instrumento de planificación local, se aprueba, no se aprueba, está obsoleto o está súper actualizado. Como que debiesen ir en carriles separados, y la nueva ley de SINAPRED así lo promueve. El problema es que ¿quién financia esos mapas de riesgo? ¿Quién modela esos riesgos? Ahí estamos muy comenzando. O sea, no hemos comenzado. Pero por lo menos hay una ley que así lo obliga.
Sí, no, para complementar el tema de la ley. Para aumentar el tema de la ley es clara. Quien tiene que hacer los mapas de riesgo es el servicio. Los mapas de amenaza los tienen que hacer los servicios vinculados, los sectores que están vinculados. Amenaza forestal, CONAF. No sé, volcánico y erupción en masa, San Giomín. Eso está claro. Ahora, evidentemente, si tú me preguntas al día de hoy, ¿hemos hecho algún mapa de riesgo luego que se hizo la ley? No, porque todavía está en un periodo de implementación del servicio. ¿Ah? Estamos recién partiendo, pero una vez que estemos con todo el músculo instalado, toda la estructura instalada, va a ser responsabilidad nuestra como servicio generar esos mapas de riesgo, es decir, cruzar la amenaza, la vulnerabilidad, la infraestructura crítica, todo, ¿no es cierto?, frente al mapa de amenaza y definir qué tan riesgoso es un lugar de otro. ¿Ah? En ese intertanto, hay que ver de qué forma somos capaces de evitar que nos sucedan los desastres. Y ahí el trabajo comunitario y el trabajo de fiscalización es importante. O sea, con lo poco que tenemos que tener la capacidad de fiscalizarlo. Y ahí siempre quedamos al debe en la fiscalización. ¿Ah? Imagínate, nosotros hoy día nos dan la función de supervisar. Es como un medio etéreo. Pero si lo hubiesen dicho fiscalizar, también no podemos, por la cantidad de personas que somos. ¿Ah? Es crear más. Y ahí viene la segunda, que es un tema casi ideológico, es más Estado o menos Estado. ¿Te das cuenta? Porque necesitamos más gente para fiscalizar. Entonces, tiene distintas derivadas para llegar al mismo fin, que es proteger a las personas.
¿Aló? Desde el trabajo que hemos realizado con comunidades, quisiera comentar dos cosas que me han quedado resonando, que lo tomo como desafío desde Cálitas Chile. Uno es la necesidad que tenemos de nuestro trabajo comunitario en el nivel local, directamente con las comunidades en riesgo, efectivamente de poder innovar para adecuarnos a los nuevos desafíos. Me hizo mucho sentido una de las frases con las que abrió Frank, que decía, no quedamos como atrapados en nuestra propia experiencia, no ser presos de nuestra propia experiencia. En Cálitas Chile llevamos más de 10 años replicando un modelo de trabajo comunitario que en términos metodológicos funciona muy bien, digamos, y se adapta a distintos riesgos. No obstante, vemos como cada año, de la mano del cambio climático también, las cosas que hacemos no van siendo suficientes. Lo que hacíamos hace 7 años no nos funciona ahora. Y en ese sentido, bueno, desde mi posición también como encargada de gestión del conocimiento, uno de los grandes desafíos es lograr una vinculación efectiva con quienes innovan, quienes generan conocimiento y quienes estamos en la implementación directa con las comunidades donde todo se mezcla, donde se ven los efectos más graves del cambio climático, donde se terminan aplicando o no los cambios normativos en términos, por ejemplo, de la ley que crea el servicio. Y uno de los actores claves con los que nos encontramos también con ciertas dificultades para trabajar por la magnitud, digamos, del trabajo que es necesario realizar, son los gobiernos locales. Son nuestras contrapartes directas a las comunidades. Nosotros somos tercer sector, sociedad civil. Acompañamos a las comunidades con una perspectiva de comunidades resilientes adaptadas al juego, pero no sirve de nada cuando nosotros definamos un ciclo de intervención y no tenemos una contraparte, un gobierno local, usualmente que pueda acoger una comunidad muy empoderada, muy adaptada, muy resiliente al juego, porque los gobiernos locales no tienen los conocimientos que incluso tienen las comunidades luego de que nosotros estamos en esos territorios. Entonces, en ese sentido, quisiera plantear también que tenemos esta dificultad para poder tener soluciones innovadoras en el nivel comunitario, respetando los saberes de las propias comunidades, porque también es algo que, digamos, genera harto resquemor cuando viene un consultor externo a decir, así se hacen las cosas, y las comunidades han vivido ahí toda su vida. Y la gran debilidad de los gobiernos locales, en su gran mayoría, en nuestro país para afrontar un escenario multirriesgo, porque ahora en el verano fueron los incendios forestales, en el invierno son las inundaciones, son los aluviones. Y en este mismo proyecto, que es parte de Botania, tenemos la misma situación en el Ñuble. Fue incendios forestales los veranos atrás. El verano pasado estaba la comunidad con el agua al cuello. Y nos preparamos de nuevo para incendios forestales en la próxima temporada de incendios.
We have the same problem.
But as we said earlier, we need to stop admiring the problem. And we know enough to get started. And as Dave said earlier, it can feel overwhelming, but we know what to do to get started. Your point that the local community has more knowledge is exactly true. I mean, when I would go to a place I'd never seen before, the first person I would try to find is a local farmer. They understand the roads, the local weather every day, water sources, where to get a repair part if I broke my truck. All those things they knew. At the same time, they have limitations on knowledge just like we do. And so it's less about saying, oh, well, I will defer to you in all things because you're local. But they don't have all the knowledge just like we don't have all the knowledge. So it's not about who has the most knowledge. It's about between us, we have the knowledge we need. How do we have that interaction? The group we met with last night, they were described to us as a local kind of a volunteer set of responders. That's not what they were. They were an all-risk fire department. They were talking about all of these things. They got started thinking about the wildland, but because they had organization, leadership, skills, local experience, people call them when there's a heart attack. People call them when someone's missing. They help in flooding situations. And so that's, I don't think we can use we can't talk about we have an idea, but there's a way to use that as a form of resilience, but it will take us working together, not, bifurcating it isn't working too well. Dave, you want to walk through this one, or you want?
So this is an output from the work being done by the team at Colorado State with graph theory. And to your point about engaging the community, it often helps to start with problem framing and incorporating what they know and what they have seen in their lived experience with the science, and to help them peer over the horizon to the future. My community, we were adjacent to two of the largest fires in California's history: 1923 Berkeley Hills Fire, the 1991 Oakland Tunnel Fire. They didn't burn into the fire district. So some folks who have lived there for a very long time, their lesson learned from that fire was we have no fire risk, which is just a quirk of the fire happened to start. The ignition point was just a couple miles to the west. Otherwise, it would have been us, right? So there's some limitations to their experience. And I think it's very helpful to hear what they have to say and to incorporate it and to ensure that the model reflects their inputs, but also to come back to the immutable laws of science and to physics that apply as well. So in this case, what Dr. Mahmood has done is by applying graph theory to the built environment, it can show with a 90-something% degree accuracy when he's reconstructed recent fires, what will happen once fire hits the first row of homes. And that's a point where the community experience is wholly lacking, because when fire starts burning home to home, the community is either evacuating or hiding. Right? They're not observing, they're not taking it in, they're not sitting, on a tower somewhere watching it all burn. And so this, particularly when animated and presented as part of the problem framing discussion, has been very helpful for us to grounding the community members to the discussion. So we begin the conversation about how to mitigate, to adapt, which is going to have many different pathways that could be used, right? There's no one right answer here. It's going to be a combination and a negotiation about what's best. But we at least begin the conversation from a single point of departure around the facts of fire science and the physics that will allow fire to flow into the community. Because in the absence of this grounding, my experience has been most people are wrong when it comes to what they believe fire is going to do, because they have a sample size of 1 or 2 or 3 fires they have seen, and they were big cataclysmic events, and they were probably very impactful to them, but they were not dispassionate trained observers taking it all in, right? They were running for their lives, which is not a great time to be doing data collection that you then extrapolate lessons learned.
Can you extend or go ahead and send the next slide? First of all, we keep using the term graph theory. Is anybody familiar with graph theory? Okay, what are the applications that you see graph theory used in?
I use it to model the visual structure of a fire experiment. This is a very specific application. Well, it's used for business. I don't know. I'm not really sure what they're using it for in non-mathematics. It's used a lot of computing.
What was your application?
Modeling, OD matrices.
It's usually about propagation.
Yeah.
I'm sure during COVID it was used. That's how we looked at spread of virus. And what did we use for mitigations to keep virus from spreading from one person to another? What were some of our tools?
Face masks.
Face masks.
Washing.
Social isolation.
Washing, social distancing, immunization. Think of those as the methods of heat transfer. Induction masking, convection immunization, social distancing, direct link. And so I didn't realize graph theory is used. We use it from determining who a social media influencer is to managing electrical grids and predicting failures. So this isn't a new science. This is science we're using and applying and relying on in huge spaces. It's just a different application. Structure to structure fire spread is a contagion, a propagation issue. I brought this slide just in case. On the left-hand side, this is the campfire. Kind of similar probably to what happened in Valparaiso. So, I mean, there are differences, and you'll notice that the red are destroyed, blue are survived. Usually once a fire starts burning in conflagration conditions on a structure, it burns to completion, unless someone puts it out or the wind stops. So on the left, you see where the structures survive. On the right, you see his modeling of vulnerability. Now, obviously there's shades there because it's a vulnerability analysis, but I would just ask you, use your eyes to follow the blue, the darker blues. Do you see the correlation? So we did a lot to get him some funding to finish off this work because we believe this approach, when you can say between these two structures, and there's only 4 ways that heat transfers. So think of 4 lines between the two structures. Usually you can't get to all of them probably, but what if you can get to 2 here, 3 here, 1 there? You start to bend down the vulnerability, just like through COVID mitigations, we started to bend down the likelihood of spread. We knew the virus was going to move through the world, actually, but we wanted to have it at a pace that was low intensity, so we didn't overwhelm our medical services. That's what we're trying to do with fire. Fire is going to exist. It's going to happen. We're trying to mitigate the intensity that it does that, so we don't overwhelm our responses and those things. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yo tengo otra pregunta. ¿Sí? ¿No? ¿No?
I can hear you.
¿Sí? Okay. Sí, okay. Sí, tengo una pregunta de doble ámbito, partiendo de desde la visión del Estado, que en Chile es bastante rígido en cuanto a lo que se puede o no se puede construir. Y en ese sentido, cuando nosotros queremos generar medidas innovadoras de mitigación, nos encontramos con temas normativos que nos impiden avanzar en eso, por lo que Roberto explicaba hace unos días sobre la rentabilidad social. Ese es un tema, y sobre eso me gustaría saber qué experiencias tienen, porque básicamente nosotros, en cuanto a medidas de mitigación, construimos muros de contención, construimos vías de evacuación, podemos construir algún parque de mitigación, pero ¿qué otras medidas de mitigación han construido ustedes a escala urbana en California? Esa es una parte. Y la segunda parte, en cuanto a vías de evacuación, ¿qué metodologías tienen ustedes para poder determinar una vía de evacuación adecuada?
To get started, I'll pick up evacuation. Oh, you have both of them.
For the things other than fields and so forth, ballparks, parking lots, etc. We make a lot of use of prescribed fire. So understanding where the fire pathway that will enter the community during the spring months when conditions are benign. We burn those plots when at the time and place of our choosing. Using fire as a mitigation is the lowest cost, has the greatest efficacy, and has the least environmental impact. And carrying out those mitigations as part of a multi-year plan can create a varied fuel mosaic, which mimics the natural state along these pathways that is highly resistant to fast-moving destructive wildfire. It's also great training because we can use our firefighters that would otherwise be sitting at the station, cooking, eating, playing basketball, all the things that the three of us did for most of our career, sadly. They like to go to burn things. So much like Tom Sawyer's fence, getting all the neighbors to come paint it, we can utilize that resource that otherwise would not be available. And thoughtful use of prescribed fire is once you get past the fear and the risk sense of it, it's very easy to recruit people to come participate in a day of burning things, as opposed to a day of cutting brush and weeds by hand. We also use grazing, where there is an opportunity to put cattle specifically on the landscape. Cattle eat down the grass every year. They produce economic benefit. So there is, you don't have to have a budget to sustain it. You have a one-time cost to put up fencing. And after that, the ranchers, the cowboys, they handle that problem for you in perpetuity. So anytime you can align things other than just the risk of wildfire with the mitigation, it's far more likely to be carried out. As was mentioned a couple of times, people are resistive. They find the loophole, they find the trick. Same, we deal with that all the time. I regularly stand in a driveway explaining to a resident why this is important, why they must do it. And it's a negotiation. You can't just tell them. And then with regard to evacuation routes, understanding the coincident route analysis, how many people need to get from here to there, what are the routes that intersect, where are the critical intersections, and where are the points that road is bisected by a fire pathway. So just like we want to keep fire out of the built environment where the homes are, we want to keep fire out of the roadway. And carrying out some roadside mitigations, particularly at the points of intersection of fire pathways, is critically important, because most communities don't have sufficient surface street capacity to evacuate all of the residents at once. They certainly don't have the capacity to do that during all the compounding factors of a wildfire, such as smoke, flames, embers, fear, that causes people's efficiency as a driver to degrade. So it becomes very important that those routes are open so we can evacuate the residents and we can respond to the firefighters. Understanding we want to use that road for two purposes going in opposite directions. And evacuating is hard. Evacuating in the midst of a fire with smoke is hard. Doing all of that while the fire engine is coming the other way is even harder. So keeping fire away from the road with those same mitigations is a very good idea.
Also, Cal Poly is right now doing a multi-year study. Have you seen the planes come through and they'll drop a retardant that may look red or pink? So you think of that during the wildfire. We're doing studies to see if we could do something quicker, or maybe we can't use one of the other mitigations. Could we use retardants in a pre-treatment way? How long do they last? You wouldn't put the red in it, of course. That's just the dye, so that the aircraft can see where they've dropped. But you can make it clear. So we're doing a multi-year study to see how effective is the retardant when you leave it on 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years. So we're doing a 3-year study with different densities of application. And then we're also doing water analysis to see what would go into the water, and we're doing plant analysis to see what is pulled up into the plants if we use it in that way. So those may be some other tools become available, but it's too soon right now.
Yo tengo una pregunta por la modelación de lo que ha mostrado los riesgos tanto del bosque mismo como de adentro del área urbana, del área construida. Me preguntaba si tienen experiencia de hacer simulación a partir directamente de fotos satelitales. Nosotros en la región metropolitana contamos ahora con una foto con una resolución de 30 centímetros. Entonces pensaba que quería saber si han tenido experiencia con hacer análisis directo de base.
So the first thing is converting the image to a fuel type so that the semi-empirical mathematical model can propagate simulated fire across the landscape. In this area, one of the advantages you have is that the vegetation is very similar and easy to classify. So you don't need 30 centimeter. In fact, the model is really optimized to run on 30-meter resolution. So much easier. In fact, the higher resolution sometimes is not particularly helpful because it's a log normal increase in the complexity, and the associated compute power goes. And the results don't really change. So 30-meter fuel model grid or pixel is ideal for a fire propagation model.
Yo doy la palabra al tiro y quería aprovechar de saludar al profesor Horacio Guilaber, que tema familiar llegó más tarde, pero llegó. Así que realmente muchas gracias, Horacio, que además ha sido parte de nuestro equipo de Kafka hace mucho tiempo, uno de los fundadores de Kafka. Y quería después darle la palabra, porque donde llegar siempre es una cosa que ya está todo funcionando, es mucho más difícil meterse, pero sí que nos pudiera contar sobre su experiencia de investigación en este ámbito y a lo mejor ahí poder enganchar. Rosario.
Una última pregunta sobre planificación.
No sé si está, creo que no está, a ver.
Sí.
Ahora sí.
Una última pregunta sobre planificación territorial. Respecto del área rural, no sé, en Chile tenemos normado como desde el límite urbano hacia adentro y hacia afuera. Y fuera del área urbana se planifica mediante lo que se conoce como área rural normada, que básicamente es regular lo que no se puede hacer en ese lugar, como el inverso de lo que se hace en está en discusión cómo se regula el tema de la interfaz rural, como baja entre el dos, el urbano y el rural. Y mi pregunta es si ustedes tienen alguna fórmula para regular, por ejemplo, los tipos de plantaciones, porque yo sé que por ahí Dave hablaba de que los árboles no son el problema, pero de alguna manera plantaciones de una sola variedad, no solo pino, solo eucaliptus, son mucho más combustibles que cuando uno mezcla varias especies. Lo que me gustaría saber si hay alguna vez o algo que nos puedan enseñar.
I'll start it and then have Dave wrap up, and Andy may have some stuff too. It's interesting. We look at managed forest, private timber forestation, and what we see is at one level, if the planting that's done at the same time is relatively new, then compared to what the fire has for fuel before it gets to a new plant, the plantation, or smaller amounts of fuel, certainly it slows down. But what we find is, if these are mature, they're so uniform, they burn 100% and very, very hot. So even there, one of the things we're trying to convince the private sector, and I know there are financial limits to this, but staggering and looking at density and the time that you are planting has a big difference on that. And we're still just, I mean, these are some new things we're working on too. So these are things we would like to work on together. We've not figured most of this out. A lot of times we figured out what not to do. That's about it.
Yeah, I would say with regard to plantations, specifically of eucalyptus or Tasmanian blue gum, which we saw a lot of outside of Valparaiso, trees are the problem in that setting, particularly monoculture with same age group. And you want, I would argue, you want to treat those just like the urban environment, because if fire gets into those, it will spread rapidly with enormous ember production, high intensity, fast spread rates, etc. But there again, there's an opportunity not only for regulation, but for economic benefit by engaging with the timber companies, the owners of the land who are planting trees to harvest, and pointing out the risk of those trees burning is a risk to their livelihood, to their bottom line, and using that to drive exterior mitigations and interior fuel breaks so they can compartmentalize the valuable merchantable timber so that they can protect their investment. That we've had quite a degree of success with that, so that in some areas of California, when fire reaches the plantations, the pine plantations primarily, it stops because they're maintained. There's the absence of ladder fuels. The ground has been cleared out, they've thinned in a way that the publicly owned forests have not, because there is no economic benefit on the public forest until the moment of sale. Where on the privately owned land, they're invested from the moment they plant that tree until they harvest it.
And I just want to stress the point Dave made. If you have an urban community here and a plantation community here, the plantation community wants to keep fire out, it's the same treatments. So especially where you have plantations in proximity to communities or utilities who also want to protect. So if you've got a big transmission line running or distribution line running through an area, wherever the communities are nearby, Andy's company and mine are working on this now, saying, wait a minute, you don't want my stuff to burn down your power lines and to replace those. We don't want to start here. Let's prioritize treatment here. And in the harvestable plantations, same thing. And so there's a motive actually for them to assist you and get a synergistic benefit between the two.
The only thing I'd add to build on what David said, is he's correct. One thing that we're doing at PG&E, so we have various levels of government in California. We have local government, which is where Dave and Frank worked off. Sorry, I called you Dave. I meant Frank. You know. It's been a long way.
Apologize to Dave.
Good point. They worked at the local government, and I worked at the state government. So at the state level, we have, it's called the Public Resources Code. And that is a code that is written that has laws that enforces clearance around homes on state lands. It also has laws for clearance around utility poles, so on and so forth. So we're able to utilize those to go ahead and enforce some of the rules, and that helps us on the defensible space. What we've also started doing in California on that note, so when CAL FIRE, the state fire department, goes and does those inspections, what we're doing at PG&E is we're coordinating with them on that. They prioritize target areas, and so we're getting the data that they have of the locations that they're working, and we're prioritizing our cleanup efforts around utility as well. So that way we're working in succession. The other thing that you're starting to see in California, and it's not really popular in the logging industry, but this hillside, if this were for sale, A lot of times you'd see in the past, the logging industry would come in, they'd call what's called clear cut. They'd cut every single tree down and then they would replant. So it's not, the people that lived around there, it's not the most appealing visual because you have some beautiful trees to nothing and then they're planting trees again. Well, so in 40, 50 years, you're going to have the exact same. What they're starting to transition to is selective tree harvesting, and it's twofold. It helps for the forest visually and environmentally, but also it's helping in the fire ecosystem as well. And it's helping to thin out the fuel source, but also it's helping with the industry. Like I said, the industry's not fond of it because it takes a lot more time, which equals money and so on and so forth. But those are some of the tools that you're starting to see used in our country.
You had said something earlier about, the regulations being very rigid. We have these rules, and it's frustrating because you get used to this very slow, rigid system, and you think this will never change. If I understand it right, you have a change going. You had a change in the government regulations. Sounds like maybe a fairly big one, fairly recently, with having to do with wildland. So I used to work for a chief, and he would I'd ask him if I could do something, he would say no. And he'd see me be depressed. He'd say, Frank, no just means no today. He might actually ask me to do that thing later, because when the conditions were better. So I think from a planning perspective, have the things that you want to do ready. It's almost like managing grants. Any of you manage grants? No? Okay. Budgets. Manage budgets? Okay. You get to the end of the budget year. If you have some money left, do you have to use it or turn it back in? So you always want to use it, right? So you always have a couple of purchases or plans or something you have in your back pocket. If you get towards the end of the year, you can shoot that through. As conditions change in the, what's socially acceptable, the politics, as elected officials understand their route to re-election has a lot to do with economics. And even though we're talking about wildfire, there's a lot of economic impact. And so if you can demonstrate that your plan or approach may solve a problem that puts them in a politically risky situation, that may not work this year or next year, but there may be a situation in a future year where that works. So it's not like you can just go straight through. Sometimes you have to develop these things and have them ready. And they say, well, what have you had for this? Go study it. I don't need to study it. It's right. I'm ready. So we're going to be at this for at least 50 years. This is going to take a
Oh, sorry.
Disculpen por el atraso. Pequeña persona. A ver, yo tengo bastante experiencia en siendo forestal comunal, empecé a trabajar posterior a los incendios en 2017, en conjunto con gente de la industrial, básicamente estableciendo métodos de toma de decisiones para justamente hacer medidas de mitigación a largo plazo. Nosotros estamos trabajando en el combate porque es un área que está básicamente cubierta por los especialistas en combate. Pues nosotros básicamente tenemos ya como 3 proyectos en el que primero pusimos a prueba una idea, que es un sistema que predice dónde se producen las emisiones. El 99% de las emisiones en Chile se producen por acción del hombre. Ese sistema predice dónde probablemente van a haber emisiones. Sobre la base de esa localización, nosotros desarrollamos un modelo de simulación de incendios. Y con ese modelo simulamos una gran cantidad de incendios para localizar áreas donde es posible hacer tratamientos de combustible. Como una línea de eliminación. Ese fue un primer proyecto en el que participé como especialista básicamente en incendios, pero nos estamos metiendo un poco más ahora en la matemática del sistema para hacerlo más eficiente, porque efectivamente se demora bastante en resolverse un problema de civilización entera, etcétera, etcétera. Tenemos ahora un proyecto en que vamos a refinar esta idea, estamos construyendo una interfaz un poquito más amigable para el usuario común y corriente, en este caso una Senapred o eventualmente algunas municipalidades. Y tenemos que resolver dos problemas muy importantes. Y el problema que yo estoy dedicado ahora, que ya en los próximos 3 o 4 años, es el problema de los combustibles forestales, en mapear cuál es el tipo de combustible que hay en un determinado año, porque parece que es muy dinámico. Este es el caso de las regiones centrales de Chile, donde hay cambios sobre el suelo en forma relativamente frecuente, por las plantaciones forestales, por la agricultura. El problema de mapear los combustibles se convirtió en un problema relevante porque nosotros no sabíamos si el simulador funcionaba bien porque funcionaba mal, porque no funciona muy bien. Funcionaba mal por los combustibles, porque el simulador tiene algunos conceptos que están errados. Entonces estamos preocupados en este momento de tratar ese tema. Entre medio hemos investigado algunas cosas respecto de lo que se llaman multiamenazas, como uno construye un mapa por territorio donde concurren más de la amenaza, además de los incendios forestales. Hay sinergia entre los distintos desastres o con daños ambientales, pero son de problemas de erosión, problemas de movimiento en masa, embancamiento de ríos. Y este año estamos iniciando dos proyectos, uno con un centro que se llama el Centro Nacional de Inteligencia Artificial, que es básicamente setear o desarrollar un sistema de detección usando cámaras, desde torres de observación y también un modelo de simulación de incendios que está basado básicamente en redes neuronales, un concepto que se llama Physical Informed Neural Network, que básicamente utiliza mucha información de incendios, de propagación de incendios, pero también es un modelo físico del fenómeno. Combinando esas dos cosas se logra de alguna manera un alcance más amplio de la simulación, especialmente en el caso de los incendios extremos, que son los que realmente nos preocupan. El otro proyecto es un proyecto un poquito útil, es un proyecto en el que vamos a evaluar la eficiencia de las evacuaciones, de los avisos de evacuaciones y cómo se cumplen esas evacuaciones, básicamente usando información de localización de celulares. Es un concepto que ya se aplicado en evacuación de tsunamis, pero ahora lo vamos a usar básicamente para evacuar, especialmente a la vez de lo que pasó este verano, ver cuál es la eficiencia de los sistemas de evacuación. O sea, en realidad el sistema de alerta, el sistema de notificación, y cómo la gente ya notificada cumple o no la normativa o la directriz de evacuación, y si es que la conoce. Entonces, es un trabajo muy intenso. Nosotros trabajamos con geógrafos, con ingenieros de recursos naturales, con ingenieros matemáticos y con ingenieros industriales para construir esta mezcla de conocimiento que permite de alguna manera hacer estas evaluaciones a nivel, pero son trabajando a nivel regional. Estamos trabajando a nivel de un rodar o de una comuna en particular. Me interesa básicamente hacer estos mapas para la región de Valparaíso, para eventualmente para todo Chile. Es todo financiamiento público.
I'm very interested in the evacuation piece as well. As a fire chief, I would, or incident management team member, I would say, okay, we've now decided we need to evacuate. So I could issue the order, just like we can write a regulation. But we had no way to know how it was actually going. We might have police officers at the intersection or something. So I think I got exposed to some of this through the Waze discussion you were having. And so it's one thing to say, think of the road system like a water system. When we design water systems, we know how to build those for like peak use periods. And then we know there's a recover period. And in the summer, the peaks are higher and different, you know. So we understand how to build systems for peak capacity to some time period and then others. Some of the ideas that people had about protecting communities are, oh, we'll just put exterior sprinklers on all the houses. Well, it's true. If you had sprinklers all around the house, it wouldn't burn. But if you turn those all on at the same time, you've completely gone outside of the peak use of the water system. The road systems are the same way. They're designed for, when you plan, you design for peak periods of use, but they're not designed to have everybody leave at once. How many of you have kids that you have to pick up at a school? What does that look like when it's time to go, like at the end of the day, when everybody shows up at the same time? Yes, I don't need to translate that. That is what happens when we do it's what happens when we do evacuations writ large, and has tragic consequences. I mean, I saw some of the pictures from here. They look just like Lahaina. They look just like Portugal. We'll have more of those. So what I'm interested in, love to work with you, is what I would like to do is say, if we know we're going to have a severe fire weather, I'd like to be able to and Dave has some exquisite experience in designing evacuation systems. But they will come and work with you and divide up your community into zones based on the transportation routes. And then what they will do is help you model how long it takes to move so many people across those streets, just like, you know, with the piping you have, how many liters per minute or hour can you move through them? And then what we want to do is we want to use a simulation table. It's made out of, you use sand and you project it over top of a topographic map, and you shape the sand to match the landscape. And then you project a satellite image of that area so people can see, oh, that's my house. It's on that hillside. That's where the road is. And then we run two simulations on it. One is we run a fire simulation that you're working on, and they get to watch that move through. And then we do is we also have an evacuation. We want to add an evacuation simulation that shows, here's how long it takes to do the evacuation. Here's how long it takes the fire to get there. Oh, look, if you don't go soon enough, the fire overtakes you. And we think that may be a helpful education tool at the community level, because the sim table is very low tech. You can take it anywhere. And then the second thing is that's during the emergency or the planning beforehand. During the emergency, I'm trying to get our federal communications oversight to allow us, the same way Waze, you know, you see that yellow and red, you know, all the cars have slowed down. They're not measuring the cars. They're measuring your phone. The phone is the proxy for the cars. The phones are a pretty good proxy for people. So if you knew that in an area that you want to evacuate has X amount, when you say evacuate, you'd like to know what it is an hour later, 2 hours later. You hope the number's going down. You might find out the number's going up, but I don't know right. And I don't care whose phone it is. It's carrier agnostic. We just need to know if you're connected to a cell site, just like Waze. Waze doesn't say, oh, here's all the movie star clients, or here's all the, I only know that one because that's what's coming up on my phone. But whoever the carriers are, Waze doesn't care. It doesn't identify to it. It just says they're here, they're going this fast, that's normal, that's not normal. But I don't know how well an evacuation's going over time. And so that's one we're trying to solve. It'd be great to work with.
Hello. Bien, yo creo que estamos ya acercándonos al término y bueno, quiero dar las gracias a todos por participar. Lo bueno que quedó grabado esto también, así que vamos a poder seguir trabajando. Solo quería comentar que es que tú partías con las conclusiones de que esto es como el final del inicio y yo creo que eso en el fondo es una cuestión de una interfase también entre la experiencia anterior y lo que viene. Yo creo que es muy interesante ahora también escuchar a Horacio sobre el proyecto en el que está trabajando. Nosotros trabajamos juntos en Kafka, pero esta es otra línea en que estamos trabajando con otros investigadores y creo que en el proyecto ahora con la región metropolitana se vuelven a encontrar nuestros caminos, así que me parece súper interesante porque la idea es potenciar esta relación con Carpoli, que también se institucionalice las relaciones a través de también un convenio entre el Estado de California y Chile, probablemente también la región metropolitana. Así es que, bien, súper contento y quiero darle las gracias a ustedes por el interés, el nivel de intensidad de participación también en las distintas actividades que hemos tenido. Que eso, y no sé si quisieran comentar algo más de cómo ven ustedes el camino a esto, también las rutas a seguir.
I'll keep it brief. I'm between you and lunch, so. One of the things we realized, and Margot has been wonderful for me. She's helping me understand the academic environment. And what we realized is our fire protection engineering, our architecture, and our urban planning have all become really exquisite. That's how we got the occurrence of fires down so low inside of the structures. But we realized we need to bring that capacity and bring some confidence to it on the outside of the structure for wildfire exposures. Because we know we can solve problems. We've done it. That those disciplines have done that. Took a while, at least in our setting, took about 50 years, but we're there. So one of the things we're looking at from the academic side is, could we concurrently develop some credentialing programs, almost like continuing education for the existing workforce in fire protection engineering, which I've got our 4 fire protection engineering schools in the US communicating to start that process, so that no single one of us can do it, but collectively we can participate in it. I haven't had only been there a year and I can only get so much done, but on the architecture side, Margo and I have been discussing that, and on the urban planning side. But the future is in the future workforce, which is our students. Now, our students are getting pretty smart about, they don't like to waste a lot of time in school. So when they're selecting classes, they look at the ones that are going to have the most value for them as workers. So if we could do credentialing of the existing workforce in ways that then were preferentially treated in plan reviews, if 3 companies put in they're competing for a plan, but one of them is with engineers and architects and planners that have a stamp of wildfire specialty, then we can work to say, that one scores high. If our students, when they're taking classes, see that credential bringing a higher value, and we say, oh, well, if you take this curriculum, when you graduate, you have that stamp. So I think that's something that we could work on, because we're doing this for 50 years. I'm not going to last that long. So we have to prepare the future, not just the students in the workforce, but these are the people that will go into those jobs in government that are now at those policy and regulation decision-making points where the doors may be closed. But when we get students who have that kind of training and prep, maybe those doors open.
Ok, yo creo que ya. Sí, bueno, estamos por terminar ya esta sesión y muchísimas gracias a todos por participar. Bueno, espero que pronto seamos capaces también de poder llevar esto en texto como un reporte de la visita y con la también asociada. Así que muchas gracias a todos.